They think they understand you, not because you explained yourself recently, but because they decided who you were a long time ago, and they never updated that decision. It feels stable to them, almost automatic, like something they don't need to question anymore. They rely on memory instead of observation, and memory gives them confidence, even when it's no longer accurate. That confidence shapes how they speak to you, how they respond, how they expect you to behave. And because nothing about you changed in a way that demanded attention, they assume everything is still the same. But something did change. It didn't happen loudly. It didn't come with a clear moment or a visible shift. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no signal that forced them to stop and reassess. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, in the way you process things, in the way you respond, in the way you choose not to respond. And because it was quiet, it slipped past their awareness. They continued interacting with you as if nothing had moved, while internally, everything had already shifted. At first, it doesn't create a problem. Conversations still happen. The rhythm feels familiar. The tone sounds the same. On the surface, everything looks consistent. But underneath that surface, something doesn't align anymore. There's a gap between what they expect and what actually happens. And that gap is small enough to ignore, but real enough to exist. They notice it, but not clearly. It feels like something slightly off, something they can't fully explain, so they dismiss it. Because when people believe they understand you, they stop paying close attention. They don't watch carefully. They don't question small changes. They operate on patterns they've already learned. They assume those patterns will continue. And that assumption becomes the lens through which they interpret everything you do. So when your behavior shifts even slightly, they don't immediately register it as change. They register it as inconsistency. And inconsistency feels temporary. It feels like something that will correct itself. So instead of questioning their understanding of you, they adjust their interpretation of the moment. They think maybe you're distracted. Maybe you didn't hear them properly. Maybe you're just tired. They fill in the gap with explanations that preserve their original belief because changing that belief would require more effort. And people don't update their perception easily, so they continue repeating the same tone, the same expectations. They interact with you the way they always have, expecting the same reactions to follow. But those reactions don't come. You respond, but there's less energy behind it. You engage, but there's less investment. You speak, but there's less need to explain. It's subtle, controlled, almost unnoticeable if someone isn't paying attention. And they aren't paying attention, at least not at first, so the pattern starts to break quietly. They say something, expecting a familiar reaction, and it doesn't arrive. They look for confirmation that everything is still the same, and they don't fully get it. And the mind doesn't like incomplete patterns. So they compensate. They repeat themselves, thinking maybe you missed something. They push a little more, trying to trigger the response they recognize. They adjust their tone slightly. It feels natural, almost automatic, like adjusting volume when something sounds unclear. But the clarity doesn't return, because the version of you they're trying to reach isn't there anymore in the same way. You didn't replace it with something obvious. You didn't create a new pattern for them to learn. You simply stopped reinforcing the old one. And without reinforcement, patterns fade. But not immediately. At first, they linger. They echo. That creates a strange kind of tension, not strong enough to confront, but persistent enough to notice. They begin to feel it more often. Small moments that don't line up. Reactions that don't fully match expectations. Silences that feel longer than usual. Responses that feel shorter than before. Nothing extreme, just uncertainty. And uncertainty changes how people behave. Even if they don't consciously acknowledge it, they start paying a little more attention. They start noticing details they previously ignored. They watch your tone more closely. They think a bit longer before responding. But here's the problem. They're still using the same reference point. They're still comparing everything you do to who you used to be. And that creates distortion. They interpret your silence based on how you used to be silent. They assign meaning using outdated patterns, and those patterns no longer fit perfectly. So everything becomes slightly misread. Not wrong enough to break the interaction, but wrong enough to create friction. And that friction builds slowly over time. Because from their perspective, nothing clear has happened. There was no moment they can point to and say, that's when things changed. There was only a gradual shift in how you engage, subtle enough to avoid confrontation, but consistent enough to change the dynamic. If the change were obvious, they could respond to it. If it were dramatic, they could match it. But this kind of change doesn't give them anything solid to react to. It removes clarity instead of creating it. So they start searching for clarity. They replay conversations in their head, trying to find hidden meaning. They analyze small details, hoping to identify a pattern they can understand. But the more they analyze, the less clear it becomes, because they're still looking for something concrete, something definable. And what changed isn't easily labeled. It's not a new behavior. It's not a new personality. It's a shift in how you participate. You're still there. You're still responding. But the way you engage is no longer shaped by the same patterns. And that creates a gap that keeps expanding. At first, that gap is easy to ignore. Then it becomes harder. Then it becomes something they can't fully dismiss. The same person who stopped observing you because they thought they understood you begins to observe again. They're trying to rebuild their understanding of you, piece by piece, using information they now realize might be incomplete. But even as they try, they run into the same problem. They're still anchored to the past version of you. So every new piece of information gets filtered through an old framework, and that framework doesn't fit anymore. And once that awareness begins, even slightly, it doesn't go away, because now they're caught between two versions of you, the one they believe they understand, and the one they're actually interacting with. And those two don't fully match anymore. But what they don't realize is that the problem isn't that they don't understand you anymore. It's that they're still trying to understand someone who doesn't exist. And once that starts happening, everything they do begins to miss slightly. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that immediately breaks the interaction, but in a way that slowly builds tension they can't fully explain. Because every response they give you is still based on a version of you that no longer fits. So even when they try to adjust, they're adjusting towards something outdated. They think they're getting closer, but they're not. They're just reinforcing the gap. At first, they don't see it as a problem. They assume it's temporary, something that will settle back into place if they just stay consistent. So they keep interacting the same way. Same tone, same expectations, same assumptions about how you'll respond. But the more they do that, the more the mismatch shows. Because your reactions don't land where they expect them to. You're still present, but not in the same way. Still responding, but not with the same energy. Still there, but not as predictable. And that unpredictability is subtle enough to confuse them, because it's not chaos, it's controlled. And controlled unpredictability is harder to understand than random behavior. Random behavior can be dismissed, but controlled shifts force attention, so they start paying more attention without fully realizing why. They read your messages twice. They replay conversations in their head. They listen more closely to tone, to pauses, to what you didn't say as much as what you did. They're trying to find consistency again, trying to rebuild the sense of understanding they used to have. But the more they look, the more they notice small differences. And those small differences don't point to a clear explanation. Instead, they create a pattern of uncertainty. And uncertainty does something most people aren't comfortable with. It forces them to question their assumptions. Because now, the version of you they rely on isn't producing predictable outcomes anymore. So, they have two options. Update their understanding, or hold on to the old one and try to make reality fit it. Most people don't update immediately. They try to make it fit. They look for ways to interpret your behavior. They tell themselves it's temporary. They assume things will go back to normal. They expect that, eventually, you'll fall back into patterns. But you don't. And that's where things begin to shift for them internally. Because every time they expect something that doesn't happen, every time they predict a reaction that doesn't come, every time they try to trigger the old version of you and don't fully succeed, their confidence and their understanding weakens. Not all at once. Gradually, quietly, almost unnoticed at first. But it's happening. And once that confidence starts to weaken, something else replaces it. Hesitation. They start second-guessing themselves. They think twice before saying certain things. They become more careful, more measured, because now they're not sure how you'll respond. And that uncertainty changes their behavior, even if they don't admit it. Because when someone no longer feels sure about how to read you, they stop acting with the same level of certainty. They start watching more, testing more, adjusting more, trying to regain clarity. But here's the problem. Clarity doesn't come from trying harder when the framework is wrong. And their framework is still based on who you used to be. So every adjustment they make is slightly off. They might give you more space, thinking that's what you need. but you're not reacting based on space. They might try to be more direct, thinking clarity will fix it. But the issue isn't confusion in communication, and that creates a loop. They try something, it doesn't fully work. They adjust again, it still doesn't feel right, and that absence of certainty is uncomfortable. So they keep trying to resolve it. They analyze more, they pay attention to patterns, they look for signals, they try to read between the lines, until eventually they can't ignore it. Something has changed. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in a way that affects everything. And once they start to see that, they face a different kind of problem, because now it's not just about confusion, it's about awareness. They become aware that their understanding might be outdated, that the version of you in their mind isn't the one in front of them, and that realization forces a choice. They can either update their perception or keep operating on the old one. And from the outside, it might not look dramatic, but internally, there's tension, because nothing feels fully stable anymore. And that instability changes how they show up. They might become quieter, more cautious, more observant, because when someone can't clearly read you anymore, they can't predict you the same way. They can't rely on assumptions, and all of that creates space. Space where there used to be certainty. Space where there used to be automatic responses. They start to realize that the version of you they built in their mind doesn't match the one they're interacting with now. And that realization changes how they see you, not instantly, not completely, but enough to shift their perspective. They never thought they would have to relearn you. They thought they already understood. But now, they do. And once that question exists, it doesn't go away easily. They're no longer interacting with certainty. They're interacting with awareness. And awareness changes everything. And that's the shift. Not something you forced, not something you explained, just something that happened. When you stopped being the version of yourself they expected. And once that happens, they can't go back, because the version they relied on isn't the one they're facing anymore. And that's the mistake they keep making, without fully realizing it. You've been watching this more than you realize, and that's exactly the point. What happens next is not motivation, it's exposure turning into behavior. Most people completely misunderstand why that works. They think learning happens in a single moment when something finally clicks. But real change doesn't happen like that. It happens in repetition, in small exposures, in patterns your brain starts accepting as normal without asking permission. That's why subscribers who stay around this content don't just understand it, they start applying it almost automatically, not because they tried harder, but because they stopped resisting the message. Your brain doesn't upgrade through intensity, it upgrades through familiarity. Every time you hear a concept repeated in slightly different form, your mind stops treating it like information and starts treating it like reality. That's the shift most people never notice. At first, everything feels like theory. Stop explaining yourself. Stop chasing reactions. Stop needing approval. It sounds almost too simple to matter. But then something subtle happens. You start recognizing yourself in it. Not all at once, but in moments. When you don't reply instantly, when you don't over-explain, when you don't rush to fix someone's misunderstanding of you, each time you don't react the old way, you're not just trying something new. You're breaking a pattern and replacing it with structured silence. That's what repetition does. It doesn't teach you new information, it removes your dependence on old responses. Most people stay stuck because they only hear things once. Once isn't enough for the nervous system. Once is entertainment. Repetition is conditioning, and conditioning is what turns awareness into behavior. That's why subscribers here notice something strange. They don't feel like they're learning more. They feel like they're reacting less, and that's the real shift. Less urgency, less explaining, less emotional overreaction to situations that used to control them. It happens because they were repeatedly exposed to a different internal standard, a different way of responding, a different pace. Eventually, the old reactions start feeling unnecessary, even uncomfortable. That's when change becomes stable, not when you force it. When it becomes unfamiliar to go back, growth isn't about more effort, discipline, or motivation. It is more exposure to the version of you that survives. Your identity is built in what you repeatedly allow your mind to normalize. If you keep watching this for exposure, something starts to shift. You stop negotiating with every emotion. You stop explaining every silence. You stop reacting just to feel in control. Instead, you observe. You delay reaction. You let distance do the work. That's not detachment. It's control through awareness. The mind trusts what it hears repeatedly. The first time you hear "stop reacting," it feels abstract. The 10th time, it feels familiar. The 20th time, it sounds reasonable. Eventually, it becomes the default voice in your head during conflict. Consistency matters more than intensity. It's not about one video changing you. It's about what happens when one idea starts appearing in your thinking without you forcing it there. And if you're still here, still following the thread, you're already in that process, even if it doesn't feel like it yet. Most changes are invisible while they're happening. You only notice when your old reactions don't show up anymore, when a trigger gets no response, when you realize you didn't over-explain, you didn't chase clarity, you didn't try to fix perceptions, you just didn't engage the old pattern. That silence you used to fear becomes your advantage. Exposure shapes identity more than effort ever will. Stay in environments that reinforce clarity and control. You don't have to force change, you become consistent with it. That's why this works steadily until your reactions stop leading your life. If you find value in this shift, stay close to it. Let repetition do what motivation never could. I'll see you in the next one.